I'm delighted to welcome you to the Institute for Government, to the, not exactly launch, but further discussion of this book by Michael Barber, How to Run a Government so that citizens benefit and taxpayers don't go crazy. The interesting contradictions and issues there. And also delighted to welcome Margaret Hodge, the chair, in case anyone has been on the moon for the last 5 years, of the Public Accounts Committee, or they're in the HMRC and wish they were on the moon. This event has been done jointly with the Centre for Public Impact. I'm delighted we're working with the Centre, and to explain what the Centre is, it's a new not-for-profit foundation set up by Boston Consulting Group to provide a global forum for governments, senior leaders and partners to help turn their ideas into impact. And it's already been active in Indonesia and India, and soon the US, but launches officially this summer. It's run by Adrian Brown, who's sitting there, who's also an alumnus of the IFG, and a colleague of Michael Barber, who's going to be the co-chair of the centre. So we're delighted for the first, indeed, of other collaborations we're doing for the centre over the next month or so. I've known Michael now for 15 years. In my journalistic days, I was one of the rare people who was very interested in his stock takes when they were published. That marked me out as a rather strange journalist to follow them. And since then, Michael and I have become friends, and because I showed that interest. And we have regular chats in various places around the world, as we have done, to follow up his thoughts and interests. He left Downing Street in 2005. What's fascinating is what he's been doing since then, working globally on the ideas and implementation which he pioneered when he was running the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, indeed before that when he was doing standards in the Department for Education with David Blunkett. He's taken those ideas absolutely fascinatingly to Pakistan. He's worked in several US states and in various other places. I mean, we saw some of his influence, some of us from the Institute, in December when we visited Martin O'Malley in Maryland, who's pioneered something called a state stat, and he originally had city stat when he was mayor of Baltimore. And that, which were very much derived from a lot of the work Michael had done on data-driven implementation and performance. So there's a worldwide impact there, and one of the interesting questions I think I'm looking forward to hearing from Michael is how his thoughts have evolved in the period since 10 years nearly since he left Downing Street. Now Margaret Hodge has actually a parallel interest, very much so, in the work she's doing at the PAC, which has been looking at what government does, successes and failures in implementation, and increasingly she's been looking on not just at individual projects, but some of the most interesting work she's been doing has been looking at systemic problems. And I think that's one of the interesting issues, that actually it isn't just in relation to one project, but often there's an underlying problem, and some of that work needs more attention. And also, Margaret's going to have quite a deep interest in that with a number of speeches and reflections. So what we're going to have is Michael's going to talk on initially about the book, then Margaret will talk for 10 minutes or so. Now, just to alert you that Margaret will have to go at 6:45, but Michael and I will carry on answering, dealing with the questions and so on until 7 o'clock. So just to alert to that at present. So, Michael, for you to kick off.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you all for coming, and thanks to the CPI from the Boston Consulting Group set up, which is a new foundation to generate exactly this kind of dialogue about how you make government more effective. And I was at the event that they organised in India about 2 weeks ago, and it was a really good debate about wrestling with the challenges of modern governance in India. So thank you to them. Yes, Peter, it's true that you were one of the few journalists to take interest in the graphs we drew and the data we collected. I remember one press conference I did with Tony Blair back then. So I used to be put through this one-day torture every year. Tony O'Connor is in the audience, did the graphs, and I would show them. And Blair and Campbell told me in advance, just be really deadpan, absolutely boring, set the facts out, no spin, just tell them how it is. And then I'd do that, and then the journalist would write up that I was boring, I was like the speaking clock, and I'd just been doing my job. But my favourite one of those press conferences was that the journalist from The Sun, I forget his name actually, was in the audience, and every single graph I put up, he just went, bullshit, like that. What he didn't know is he was sitting next to Tony O'Connor, who was the guy who had made the graphs in the first place. So Tony was giggling and that this journalist was saying bullshit. Anyway, that was then. The other thing I wanted to say by way of introduction is it's a real pleasure to be on a platform with Margaret Hodge. I was just telling her my wife's hero in politics is Margaret, so I mustn't upset her. But also, I thought I'd tell a story. Margaret may not remember this, of the first meeting I had with Margaret when she was leader of Islington Council. I was chair of education in Hackney, and there was a debate between the two bordering boroughs about some special schools as the ILEA was being broken up. And I went along with this wonderful official from Hackney to argue that a couple of the schools that we had should go to Islington, a couple of the ones that had gone to Islington should come to us just because of the patterns. And I'd been really well briefed up by this brilliant official, and so Margaret said, after the pleasantries, said, "Okay, what's your case, Michael?" And I said it out, and she had an official sitting on, do you remember this, Margaret? No. You had an official sitting on your left, and she said, after I'd finished, she said to this official, "What's our answer to Michael?" Like that. And he kind of rambled for about 5 minutes, and he was struggling, definitely. He clearly, I don't know whether he didn't know what was coming or why he was there. And at the end of his contribution, Margaret looked at me and said, "You can have exactly what you want, Michael," and then looked at this official, "Because I'm so badly briefed." And I think anybody who's been in front of the Public Accounts Committee probably knows what that guy felt like at that moment. Of course, I was delighted. So Peter asked me to speak about what I've learned since the number 10 days, which I'll focus on. But I've got 3 different types of learning that I've done over that 10-year period. But let me just start to remind you what the model is that we're talking about, that we developed then. Many of you are very familiar with it, but basically set some priorities and turn them into measurable goals. Point 1. Set up a dedicated unit that's focused on delivering those priorities and is not a policy and strategy body, but is absolutely focused on getting stuff done against those priorities and can't be deflected. Make sure you've got data and trajectories. You know whether you're making progress or not towards those goals. Build some routines into the way your department, or in this case, the whole government, worked against those priorities. So I'm talking here about the stock takes that Tony Blair chaired every 2 months on each key department, health, education, crime and transport, which kept the focus on the priorities, and they routinely happened right the way through that period. We also had monthly notes that went to Tony every month on each of the key subjects that became very familiar to him, that he could read in 2 or 3 minutes on a Sunday afternoon at Chequers. So goals and priorities, dedicated unit, data and trajectories, routines, such as the ones I've mentioned, and then problem solving. So when through that process, through the data, through the stock takes, or whatever, through the dialogue you're having with the department, solve the problems as they arise. And we developed a whole series with departments of problem solving processes. And finally, persistence. Stick with it, because there's lots of temptations in government to keep shifting the agenda, either in response to crises or in response to new things that emerge, either in the media or in the real world. But you've got to keep a focus to get these things done over a 4 or 5 year period. And around all that, building relationships in a way that is constructive. The way I talk about it in the new book about the relationships, when I used to go to Russia when Russia was a happier place to visit, my Russian friends started teaching me little bits of Russian, and they said there are only 2 questions you need to learn in Russian for any conversation with the government. Hello, please, and thank you will get you through the rest. One is who's to blame, and the other is what's to be done. And our relationship approach was very much focused on asking what's to be done first. So if there's something going wrong, let's solve the problem and leave the blame, if there is any blame, to later. If you answer the blame question first, it's very hard to get people to talk through the problem. But of course the media in the meantime is yelling heads must roll, so it's hard to do that. So that's the model that we're talking about, that we developed in number 10, that some of you experienced directly, some of you were involved in it, and some of you read the the book afterwards, my previous book. But so what have I learned since then? Well, so I'm going to talk about learning from reflection, learning from history, learning from elsewhere in the world, and then finally just comment on how the world has changed, because that makes a difference too. So from reflecting on all of that, one of the things that I think has become really clear over that 10-year period, and much more important in global terms, is how important effective government is. The financial crisis brought it home. The collapse of government in places like Libya and Somalia and parts of the Middle East makes it really clear how important effective government is to success. It's almost like one of the big moral issues of our times. Whereas I think when I look back at that time, I think we just kind of assumed that government was kind of more or less effective, but it would always be basically okay. I may be exaggerating slightly, but I think that the importance of it's come much more clearly to the fore. The second thing is, there's a perfectly legitimate political debate in pretty much every country about whether you want small government or big government, whether you would rather take less of GDP in tax and leave more in people's pockets, or take more and provide public services. And you might want to be Sweden, or you might want to be Singapore, or you might want to be something in between. But that is a political choice. But whichever of those two things you believe, effectiveness of government is really profoundly important. And it's when government ceases to be effective that you get lots and lots of problems. So I've written the new book explicitly without choosing between small and big government, but saying what would it take to be effective. Third reflection, back then, I think we did get eventually very good at focusing on outcomes. And when I say we, I mean lots of people working in government delivery unit, but also in the departments, ministers and others. So we got very good at focusing on outcomes, but we didn't focus enough on productivity. Were the outcomes being delivered at the best value in terms of the amount of tax pounds we were spending? If I look back on the health reforms, actually it was a really sustained period of delivery, but it was also a sustained period of 7 or 8% growth in health budgets over that period of time. Could we have been better and sharper and more effective on productivity? And obviously, the period since then brings that into sharp relief. Fourth thing from reflection, there's a little bit about Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike, at his time when he was preparing the Normandy landings. I use lots of historical references in the book, where he says, reflecting back on his military career, the plans were useless, but the planning was indispensable. And I think that's true about delivery. So we spent, if I look back on our first year in the delivery unit, too long asking for plans, whereas what we should have done was got a good enough plan and got working, and then used the routines and the data to refine the plans as we went. So the planning is absolutely essential, but a plan that's in a glossy cover and sits on a shelf is really not that important. And then the last reflection, learning from reflection, is how hard culture change is in large organizations, whether it's the civil service or teachers or doctors. Back then, I occasionally reluctantly would go to the GP for whatever my latest minor health complaint was, and I hated it because I just got an earful of complaints about the targets. Now when I go to the GP, I'm getting older, so I go slightly more often, they look back on that era as a golden age. And I said to them, well, why didn't you tell me that then? How do you know a golden age till it's gone, as it were? And so they look back on Alan Milburn as a hero and the targets as perfectly achievable, and wasn't that a great time? But at the time they were complaining culture change is very hard. And I think culture change about delivery in the civil service is hard. And some of that has sunk in, and there's still a long way to go. So all of that. Second area of learning I want to talk about is learning from history. One of the things that made the new book, fun to write is I realised, I used to study history, and I still read lots of history books. I realised that although obviously people back then didn't think they were doing delivery in the sense of a modern delivery unit and all of that, but they did some of the things that make delivery work, of course, because they were sensible people. And I've got lots of stories from the past that illustrate this. One of the least well-known American presidents, although Peter would know it because he's a doyen of American history, is Calvin Coolidge, who was president in the 1920s. And there's a recent biography of him that's actually very good. And he's as good an example as you can find in politics of a complete routine focus on his priorities. His priority was to cut the budget. and cut taxes and get rid of the deficit. He achieved all of that. And every Friday, for an hour and a half, he sat with his budget director, who was a guy called Lord, and they cut budgets. They went through line by line through budgets. If you're a civil servant, those of you who are civil servants now and worry about the pressure of cuts you've been through, just bear this in mind. If you're a civil servant under Coolidge, you got given a pencil, and you could only get a new pencil from the supplies when you brought back a stub less than half an inch long. That's how far they cut budgets. So you ain't seen nothing yet. So I've got stories like that represent the change. I love the story of Edmund Dudley, the guy who worked for Henry VII. Henry VII is arguably the best king England ever had. Not the nicest, but the best. He inherited a deficit, he left a surplus, he inherited a complete mess and a civil war, he left a country stable, and if his oldest son Arthur had survived, rather than leaving Henry VIII in charge after he died, who knows what might have happened. But he had a guy called Edmund Dudley, who was a lawyer. Henry VII dispensed with using the nobles as his advisors, which his predecessors had done, because they were all self-interested and trying to aggrandize themselves. So he had all these clever lawyers from the city advising him. And Edmund Dudley was one of those. And they'd sit in Westminster Palace going through line by line. How can we screw more money out of the city? How can we screw more money out of the nobles? Or how can we screw more money out of the church? They were the only three sources of money you could get back then. The sort of person that Margaret would have really liked having worked for her in the National Audit Office. And it was phenomenally effective. Problem was, when Henry VII died, a very easy way for Henry VIII to increase his poll ratings was to have Edmund Dudley executed. And that worked too. So I'm just saying, history is full of these stories of people who do the kinds of things that we need. And I won't go through more of the stories, but there's plenty in there. What have I learned internationally? Well, the first thing I've learned, and this is really important, is the model is sound. The model I described at the beginning, if you do that well, you've got a really good chance of improving the outcomes. So in the work in Punjab in Pakistan, in the last 3 years, we've added 2 million children to the school rolls. The teachers turn up as at the same percentage as they do in Wales right now. The buildings are fixed, the water runs, the electricity turns on when you press the light in pretty much any school. There are new textbooks. The learning outcomes are still pretty bad, but they've gone up. And I think if you can do it in Pakistan, you can do it pretty much anywhere. And I've seen it in work in Maryland, in Indiana, in Los Angeles, in Louisiana, in Massachusetts, Malaysia, Ontario, and through the work that Tony Blair's Africa Governance Initiative done. It's worked in Sierra Leone and Rwanda. So this is a model that you can put in place, and it's generally applicable. And one of the things that I think is quite unique about my new book is it's the first book to write about how to manage government regardless of whether you're talking about the developing world or the developed world. It crosses that divide because the same core principles apply. So that's one thing I've learned internationally. Secondly, there's no substitute for political will. Peter Riddell and I were talking about this on the way in. If you don't have politicians who want to make big changes, it's really hard to do this stuff without some kind of political backing. So the Chief Minister in Punjab is a phenomenally effective politician. Governor Martin O'Malley of Maryland was a very, very effective politician. If you don't want to change things, if you're not willing to be disciplined about priorities, if you haven't got the courage to take on big, complicated challenges, it's much harder to do this stuff. It will improve marginally the way government is run, but political will is really important. Thirdly, sticking to the priorities is really hard, but you really have to do it. And so who's going to be the person that keeps that running? I remember very well September the 11th, 2001 in number 10, when there's a mill of people around Tony, of course, all the kind of people you need, transport people and foreign office people and spies and military and etc. And I'm walking past, and the first instinct is to rush in and say, how can I help? But I didn't do that. I thought my job is actually to keep the rest of the show on the road. Somebody has to do that when the crisis comes up. Another learning, which is culturally specific, is how to make sure that when there's a review, a stock take review, it's an honest conversation. It's very difficult in a deferential setting like Punjab for the officials to tell the chief minister what's actually happening. They're afraid of telling him how bad things are when they're bad. The first meeting I had with the chief minister, one of the officials said to me on the way out, "You shouldn't tell him what he doesn't want to hear." And that person is a good person, and since then he's become a big fan of all this stuff. But it's very hard to make sure there's an honest conversation. But without that, obviously, you can't do it. You need the data, you need the right people in the room, and then you need some way of creating the circumstances in which you can have an honest conversation. But if you get it right, the skeptics will become fans of it, and it will make a difference. And then finally, a few reflections on how the world has changed. Some of this is really obvious to you, but it does make an effect. So the global economy, remember, has been through a major economic financial crisis, and that's raised issues about the effectiveness of government, the productivity of government, and the importance of delivering better outcomes while controlling public expenditure, which is why the office that Margaret holds is so important. And to me that is massive, but it's also raised another issue which I think is equally important and equally challenging, which is how do you regulate markets effectively? All markets are human constructs. It's not regulation versus markets, it's the right regulation to make markets effective. And we saw the damage done by badly regulated markets. We saw the damage done when people operating inside of markets argue that what they did was morally okay because they worked within the rules. But there's a difference between the rules and what's morally okay. And getting markets to work effectively, to me that is a major issue, and getting regulation to work effectively is also important, and how you do that in a fast-changing world where by the time you've changed the regulation, the nature of the products has moved on. So I think there's a whole kind of theory of regulation challenge facing all of us. So that's one whole area. And in the book I've talked about, in the strategy chapter, 5 different ways of reforming things and the role of government as a steward. And the simple definition of steward is whatever you inherit in government, among other things, your job is to leave it in better shape when you finish than when you started. And getting the regulatory regime is part of that. So the second thing that's changed is geopolitics. It feels like a substantially more uncertain, dangerous world, even in the last couple of years, than it did before. That's going to affect, for example, pressures on defence spending. It's going to affect thinking about all of the issues of what you want to deliver, but it's also going to sharpen the focus even more on the importance of effective government, courageous politics. So that's a huge change. And if you don't get your own house in order, it's really hard to be effective on the international stage. And that's one of the reasons why over the last 4 or 5 years the West has looked relatively weak, and that's caused a lot of problems. So the way you manage your own government, the effectiveness with which you do that has implications for international relations in a very significant way. A third thing, again kind of obvious but really important, is the explosion of data, big data. Tony O'Connor's in the room. I might let him talk about that later. But the availability of data, the transparency of data, the extent of data, making sense of it, making use of it, is a potentially very powerful instrument inside of government and in dialogue with the public. And that changes things quite dramatically, whereas we were struggling to get any data, for example, on road performance back in 2001, whereas that is now very, very easy. Fourth thing that's changed, last 2 points, Peter. One is our knowledge of how to do delivery has increased. I was really struck writing this book and looking at experiments on different continents by the burgeoning literature on this whole area that's just beginning to emerge, nearly all of it in the last 10 years. And that is only to be celebrated. It's not all positive about what the original delivery unit did, I'm not arguing that, but there's a whole literature about how to do this that is becoming more practical. And the other thing that's changed over that time is the willingness of governments to learn from each other. There's much more international dialogue about how to do government, whether it's within subjects like educational health or more general, which I find very helpful. And the Jim Kim, the president of the World Bank, talks about the emerging science of delivery, and he's trying to sort of pull that together, and my book is explicitly an intention to contribute to that. So that has implications for British politics, but the other thing that's changed is British politics. When we did the delivery, it's hard to remember now, there was a Prime Minister with a majority of 170 in Parliament, didn't have to worry too much about getting stuff through. Now we have a coalition. We look at the opinion polls, we think we may well have another coalition again. Peter's the expert on all this. But doing delivery for a single, powerful, effective Prime Minister is a very different thing than doing delivery for a coalition government. And I think that's something we can explore in the conversation, Peter. So all of that is my set of reflections. I hope that's helpful. I hope you'll enjoy the book. The one Peter held up was the advanced reading copy with a lot of typos in. The real one looks like the one Margaret's got. We have sent Peter the real one as well. But
otherwise I might get confused, Michael.
Anyway, thank you very much for listening.
Before introducing Margaret, the evocation of Calvin Coolidge, the antithesis of the soundbite politician. He was once at a dinner and there was a woman next to him who said, I've been bet that can I get you to say more than 3 words, you lose. That was Coolidge. Not quite the politician. He was remarkably effective despite that, that approach, rather neglected period of US history. Now, lots of very interesting thoughts from Michael about how things have changed, the changing political environment, the changing spending environment, big data, which I think was a very important point, all shape the world in which you work, Margaret. So, over to you.
Thank you. Well, can I start? Michael's been one of my heroes because during that period of the Labour government, really, your lasting legacy for me was the numeracy and literacy strategy, which you managed to get implemented. It was the biggest feat in implementation, and I think has had a lasting effect on educational standards. He and I both worked for David Blunkett, and I've just come from an event celebrating David's 28 years in Parliament and moving on. And I'm sure, Michael, you've shared with me that horror that we always used to have on Monday mornings. You'd get these memos from David saying, what on earth have you decided over the last week? This is a load of rubbish. I completely disagree with what you're doing. You will now undo your bit of implementation. With very warm wishes, David. Anyway, I think I've skimmed your book. I've read bits of it, but I haven't read it all in detail. But I just do think that if every permanent secretary had some of those charts up on their walls, reminding them of how to implement good government regularly, we would actually achieve a huge improvement in government. So I hope you do have an impact, and I'm sure we will all read it. I want to start on the good practice because we've looked at a lot of good practice. It never gets publicity. Apologies to you that heard it before, but absolutely typical was that we did this report on 16 to 18-year-olds, which was a good report. And I get the traditional phone call from the Today programme saying, will you come on and talk about it? And then I said, fine. And she said, what are you minded to do the research, the researcher? So I said, well, I'm minded to say it's a good programme, room for improvement, but it's not doing badly. She said, I thought you were going to be critical. I said, no, it's a complimentary report. She said, I better go away and read it. And when she went away and read it, she then dropped me as an item on the agenda. But we have got some good things we looked at, and they have, I was thinking just in the 2 minutes in preparing this, Crossrail is going well. The prison building programme, interesting enough, was a programme we looked at, which is being effective. The Troubled Families programme is probably a success. I've chosen 3 very different programmes, and they all have the features that you talk about in the book. So clear objectives, which are sort of settled and defined, proper planning with some regular milestones, consistent leadership and a good team, good information. And I have to say to you that all too often what we look at is there might be a mass of data, most of it is irrelevant, too little of it is of value in ensuring effective government, strong monitoring, effective partnerships, and they all have led to good outcomes. So there are some good stories to tell. And again, I think one of the frustrations we felt in the committee is that there just isn't an infrastructure in government to learn from the good, as well as learning the lessons from things that go wrong. So you've got very rational and sensible models. Why don't they work more often? And I think that was what I tried to sort of think about. And why does it take a deficit reduction program even to get people really focused on trying to get more for less? One of the depressing things really is that we didn't do better when we were in government in ensuring greater effectiveness and value for money. And I think it's as important, hugely important from the left as it is from any part of the political spectrum. And I say this really because I actually believe if we were more efficient at using the money, if we were more effective at implementation, if we did reduce waste, we could fulfill all the radical ambitions that we have on the left without raising taxes. And that's quite a statement to make, but I think that plus getting the money in from taxation is really important. So what were my reflections on what you said and what I thought about? Systems matter, but so do people. And I think probably I'd come at it from the people perspective. And I still think we have a problem that the focus is on policy in government and not sufficient focus on implementation. And actually, I may slightly quarrel with you. I think it's more important to have people devising policy also being responsible for implementation, because they might every now and then devise rather more sensible policy if they took responsibility through the system. And that, you talked about culture change, and I think that's the biggest challenge we've got. Too many people still believe that their role in the civil service is simply to dream up new ideas. Too many politicians believe that as well. And really, what we've got to do in modern government in the 21st century, it's about effective implementation that really matters for people. So we recruit endlessly bright people into the public sector. We have hundreds of thousands of committed, intelligent individuals, but we don't use them right, we don't train them right, we don't give them the key skills they need in a modern context. People don't stay in the job long enough. It's an endless problem that we see through. There isn't consistency of leadership. We're on, I think, our 4th or 5th project manager for the universal credit. And I endlessly say I think we're going to be writing off £700 million after the general election and starting again on a project which actually has political buy-in across the parties and therefore ought to have been more readily implementable without a consensus around it. And my great example of the fire control system, when we tried to rationalise the use of 999 numbers, we had 10 people responsible for that programme in 5 years, and inevitably we ended up writing off nearly £500 million. Politicians also move too often, and every politician has new priorities. And I think we needed a learning curve. I always say this, that I was a minister through most of the Blair-Brown years, but it was only in my very last year in DCMS, when I came back into the job, that I thought, I've got a year at this, I'm going to limit my priorities. And I had 7 priorities, saw them all through. But why did it take me so long to understand that that was the way to get effective government? So all of us moved. And actually, I think coalition has been a good thing. It was another observation on what you said, because what coalition has done is opened up decision-making a little bit more than it has in the past. And that strengthened it. And so I would hope even, whatever happens after this general election, the greater openness, the less its transparency is key. It may be something that you didn't sort of talk about that much in the book, but transparency is key to ensuring that you get rather more sensible policy making and more effective implementation. And then it's not just the political leadership that counts. I often say this, and I say this with a bit of sadness, but the impression I've had over the last 5 years from the senior civil servants that I've seen appearing in front of our committee is that they are the most resistant to change. That top cadre of civil servants do act as a sort of Freemasonry. They reject outsiders all too often, and they don't want to move to the modern. There really is a resistance to change. And the honest conversation that you talked about is so important. It doesn't happen in the UK. And optimism bias is an endless finding that we have in our reports. So I think people matter. I also think your system has to be located in a culture. And when I look at the UK system, I think the accountability system is broke, and we need to think about that. The tradition of having civil servants accountable to ministers who are then accountable to Parliament means you don't have an open, transparent system of responsibility and accountability going hand in hand, And I think that is critical to more effective delivery. And I always say, when this was all invented by Haldane, there were 28 civil servants in the Home Office. There are now, despite the reductions, probably about 26,000. And there's an essential problem with the fundamental flaw in the whole concept of ministerial accountability, in that if ministers were really accountable, they ought to have the power to hire and fire. So I think we do have to fix that accountability framework. We have to link responsibility to accountability, and I think that would be an important contribution to getting more effective delivery. My third observation is that we're a bad learning organisation, the UK government, UK public sector, and I think that's about transforming the role of the centre in government. We've got the pretty dysfunctional centre. You've got Cabinet Office vying with Treasury and the number 10 bod sitting somewhere in the middle. And for me, I would bring those three elements all together. It would require a bit of ministerial shifting, but I think that's not a bad thing. The Prime Minister is the Prime Minister and ought to control it. And I think if you've got a more coherent centre, and you then actually exercise the real power that a centre would exercise in a complex private organisation, you would get a better learning from what works and what failed to work. And one of our frustrations has been particularly with Treasury, who dole out the public money, fail then really to think about whether it's well spent or badly spent, and don't think about things that have worked well and badly across government to ensure that successes are mirrored and failures are rectified. PFI is the great thing, relationships with private contractors, doing all that stuff. There's a lot of learning that we could do with a stronger centre. And stronger centre doesn't mean, it's strong, weak. You can have a centre, which is the learning organisation at the centre, with still great decentralisation. You talked about productivity, and I think that is a hugely, hugely difficult issue. I remember when you and I were both in education, high product, if you have fewer teachers, you could, in a very crude measure, say that's higher productivity, but is it the sort of productivity that we want? But again, I think the best is probably the enemy of good there. And we are bad again at comparing and contrasting. And I think about the abolition of the Audit Commission, Peter, and that actually is going to make us weaker again in trying to have that, take advantage of open data to be able to make the comparisons that we want to. So those are my sort of very, I don't want to go on to more because everybody here has got a lot to contribute, but I think it's a great book. I think it's really important. I think the challenge that you set of doing more for less rather than invest to reform is hugely important. I always say, for me, health is the key there. It's the elephant in the room, really. And if we were just to take your structure and try and apply it to dealing with the challenges in the health service rather than the myths we like to promote in politics, we might really be able to build a health service that is sustainable and provides good health universally, free at the point of vote. So great book, important reading, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Margaret. That's absolutely fascinating from the parallel perspectives you've had on that. Michael, do you want to say anything immediately? Because I've got some questions I want to pursue on that. Can I get on to one which you mentioned, which is very interesting, which is big data? Because, as you said, when you started out, there wasn't much data available, but now anyone can look at data on large amounts of performance. How does that alter the role? Because people themselves can reach the assessment. They don't require the regular stock takes. They can do their own assessments.
Well, well, the first thing is, Margaret makes a good point. So there's a lot of data out there, but it's not all good, and somebody's got to make sense of it. And if you're a busy Prime Minister, or top civil servant for that matter, having somebody who can take that massive data, ask the right question. I always say you've got to get the data, you've got to ask the right question, then you've got to present it in a way that is compelling and interesting. Unless you do all of those three, the master is here, Tony O'Connor. Unless you do all of those three things, however much data you've got, it doesn't have an impact. The other thing, which I think is really important, is at the moment of decision, you need the right people in the room, and you need the right data. So they've got a shared understanding of the data, and that's the beauty of the stock take. So however much data is out there, the stock take meeting where you've got the right people in the room that you can take a decision. So I'll give you an example. In the Punjab work, we've been doing an education for now 4 years, but last year the Chief Minister said he wanted to apply the same broad approach to improving primary healthcare. And lots of people were saying, well, why do we need this? So we started looking at the data, my team and I, and we found that the infant mortality rate in Punjab, Pakistan is 88 per 1,000, which is terrible. We found that now, so one way is just to present that term, but then we also found that Punjab, India, the infant mortality rate is 37 per 1,000, 88 to 37. They're neighbouring provinces. They were the same province till 1947. And in Sri Lanka, it's 8 per 1,000. So now I've got really compelling data, 3 bars on a very, very simple graph. I can put that in front of the Chief Minister. He's never seen that data before. When I show him that data, from that moment on, I know he will want to change it. He hates being worse than Punjab, India, for good reasons. He's amazed that Sri Lanka can be 11 times better than he is. And he turns to the health officials down the left-hand side of the table and says, how can you sleep at night? Go and fix that. And we're already making inroads into it. So the data, however big the data is, it's intelligent analysis and compelling presentation.
But isn't one aspect of big data that, of course, it's publicly available?
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest difference, in a sense, is that the exclusive, the political world and civil service world's control on data no longer exists. Now, I take your point on bad data. I mean, to give the example of which we saw in Maryland under state stat and what Martin Valley did, it's publicly available. You can see what's happening in various areas, you know, of where the state government operates. So it's not just a matter internally. And I wonder how that changes the political balance.
I think it means that anybody can do the really good analysis and the compelling analysis, so including, there's some journalists who are now getting really good at this. Chris Cook on Newsnight, for example. And so I think that is interesting. And I think the argument that I would have made in 2005 for keeping the data internal is now gone. You might as well just put it all out there and hope that, you need good people doing your analysis internally, but you're also looking for the analysis that's being done externally. So it puts a premium on high quality analysis that is close to the point of decision.
I mean, Margaret, one of the things, in a sense, you're trying to prize out data often in the PAC on how contracts have been run and so on. But isn't your world, and the world of the NAO, going to be changed by that? Because a lot of people, not necessarily on contracts, but on performance, the data's out there.
Well, the problem is you're sitting there talking, what we see is the paucity of relevant key data, both being published and then being used to have more effective government. And in a sense, I think the abolition of the Audit Commission is the most interesting thing, because the whole premise was that with the abolition of the Audit Commission, you'd have all the data out there, so citizens in every little borough, in every little local authority would be able to judge whether or not their authority is performing well. We haven't got armchair auditors. You don't have masses of Chris Cooks who are going around analysing the data. So there is an onus actually on the government machine to produce effective, and I don't know why they can't get the, I think probably lack of relevant data used properly is one of the most consistent findings in our report of where things go wrong. That is a scary thing, because people think data is not terribly sexy, which is the most important, or used at the right time. Yeah. So it's lack of, we just don't use, so it's all out there, but we don't know what's out there. We don't isolate what we need, and we don't use it properly.
Well, I just go plug for the Institute at this point. We are doing our best on analysing data by what we call the Vital Monitor, which we're now using increasingly online, as well as our annual report and so on, to actually analyse data. And what's interesting is the take-up and how people are responding to that. On political leadership, I take exactly what you say on that. But in practice, all right, you get the charismatic leader, the big leader for change. how do you sustain it? Because human nature being what it is, you're not going to have a consistent level of political leaders who are all going to have as much interest in driving performance as the one who starts the process. Now, I know part of your answer is good routines, but are they enough? Because a routine can slip back towards the mean. A routine can become something people ignore, Michael.
Well, it's you. The chapter 7 of the book is called Irreversibility.
Yeah, indeed.
I've tried to think about this at different levels. So political irreversibility, how do you get a big change irreversible? Well, one of the downsides of democracy is there are no guarantees. We're all in favour of democracy, but you have to, in the end, it will throw out weird and wonderful outcomes. Sometimes. If you can deliver a change big enough that the people really appreciate it within a timescale, then there's a really good chance that that will then be adopted. So there's a whole thing about political irreversibility. Then there's irreversibility within the government machine, and here I don't know what Margaret thinks, but slightly implied in what you said about your own ministerial career, but in the Blair administration there were far too many reshuffles and too many people moving around. That makes it much harder. I must say credit to the current administration. They've been much more stable in ministerial leadership. So I think that matters, because then you can learn your way in. I think the civil service learning some of these lessons and applying them and then becoming just part of the way the civil service does business is really important. So there's different levels of irreversibility. But in the end, you've got to try and persuade people that what you've done is worth having and they want to vote for it in the future. It's very different, and I talk about Sweden and Norway and Germany in the book, where they have these rather long, slow, consensual processes. A very good book by a Yale political scientist who's Norwegian called Steinring. It's called A Nation of Devils, and basically it's a Scandinavian critique of Britain and America. And his solution is, if I summarise it, maybe a bit unkind, is why can't you all be like Norway? Yeah. But there's actually quite a lot of reasons why we can't be like Norway. So it's much harder in a combative political culture.
Yeah.
Can I just?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think actually, what's been interesting for me in the last 5 years is trying to build cross-party consensus around the reforms that are essential to provide more effective implementation. And Francis Mort has been reaching out to try and build that consensus, so that you don't face that cliff edge that at a general election or to change of ministerial position, you then things go back to where they were before. And I think the work that you've been doing has been important, and I think the work that John Healy and Nick Herbert have been doing is also important. So for me, the key on this is that if we can build really a cross-party consensus, which will then drive reforms over time, because the culture change is very tough and takes a long time, it's absolutely central. And if we don't do it, we won't improve on delivery. I'm really convinced of that now.
So Andrew is in the room and managed to achieve irreversibility on academies and maybe now on Crossrail, Crossrail, but also high speed too. I mean, and that is a personal political achievement as well as a general one. But Andrew would have a view on that, on the question you asked, I think.
No, before opening it up, and there are a lot of people in this room who've got some very interesting views. Another thing, which I was talking to someone about, your book was coming out, and said his reaction, and you touched on exactly that point in your opening remarks, Michael, was it was all very well for Michael, but public spending was increasing then. That more spending could be put into certain areas, and once it was established by Tony Blair, this is a priority. That whether it was street crime or the railways point, punctuality, all those things, there was money available, and you acknowledge that. But your argument is, in a sense, it's even more necessary in an area of restraint. But it does alter the context and the levers, doesn't it? When you haven't got extra money available to achieve the goals, which you had for a lot of your period, both in education and number 10.
Right, that's true. Although, actually, Margaret mentioned the National Literacy Strategy. The achievement of that was before any of the big increases in spending came. So, and every pound you spent on the National Literacy Strategy influenced £100 of teachers' salaries. And I think thinking about leverage ratios is an important part of this. But it's true. It was a time of growth in public expenditure, and the mantra was investment for reform. And as I say in the book, and in my FT article today, now it's got to be more for less, and that's the challenge and that the work that Margaret and others have been doing. and it is more important than ever, and we know more about how to do it, we've got better data, and the delivery unit, it's worth remembering this, we never ever said to a department, you need more money to achieve this target. If they thought they needed more money, we sent them to the Treasury. So we always assumed that you could achieve the big goals without increases in expenditure, but they had decent and growing budgets. So I agree it's harder, but it's also more necessary, and we also know more, we've got more experience globally of how to do it. And if we apply that knowledge in a systematic way, we can do it. And Margaret highlighted at the beginning of her remarks 3 or 4 programs that are delivering, even in an economic climate. So we know it can be done. And Martin O'Malley delivered through 8 years right through the economic crisis. Mitch Daniels, different party, but similar track record of delivery, left a surplus even having going through the economic crisis. So you can do this, but I think we need to get into effective measures of productivity where you're saying we want these outcomes for this amount of money, and then Margaret and the NAO or the Treasury should be able to compare the outcomes in broad terms for the inputs and use that to allocate future money, and not allocate money to deal with problems and failures, but to allocate money to reward governments that, or parts of government that succeed.
Which, of course, is what we do on the health service. We allocate money for failure.
Yeah.
And on local government, if you can juxtapose the two, which has had huge expenditure cuts in terms of its grant, there's been really innovative changes in the way that they have chosen to deliver their services, including the development of new services, despite that massive cut in their thing. So it's really interesting. So health gets rewarded every time it fails. Local government actually gets punished every time it succeeds.
That's a good note to open it up. Right, questions. Right, I'll start here. Adrian, identify yourself, even though...
Thank you. Adrian Brown from the Centre for Public Impact. Thank you, Michael and Margaret, for excellent and very thought-provoking speeches. One paradox I think that people around the world see with the delivery unit model that's been so successful, as you say, Michael, has been replicated elsewhere, is that in the UK we scrapped it. And we decided 2010 that we didn't need a delivery unit anymore. And reflecting on why that is similar to the point you made, Margaret, is why do we not do the sensible thing? The paradox I would highlight would be that the success of the delivery unit required that very strong political sponsorship from Tony Blair, and that made it rather too associated with a particular political actor that made it perhaps easier for other people to get rid of it later. So is there a paradox in the sense of the delivery unit model that means ultimately it'll always get scrapped by someone who follows on from it?
Or revived.
Or well.
As it
It has been revived, actually. One of the things I talk about this a bit in the book. After some time, Steve Hilton, then in Number 10, called me and said, when I go and see him, and he didn't say what it was about, and I went in to see him, and he said, I know we rubbished all that delivery and targets and stuff, and then he paused and said, but how did you do it? And then we had a conversation. At the end of the conversation, he said, do you think we could do all the same stuff and give it a different name? And I said, yes, I'm sure you could. And there is an implementation unit, and the recently appointed, it's been there for a while now, but the new head of it, James, is at the back of the room, and we may want to get him to comment because that would be valuable. But one of the things I said, there's all this stuff on it, how you become expert. It takes 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to become expert at golf or chess, right? If you measure 10,000 hours of prime ministerial time, about 3.5 years, if you work hard, you've done 10,000 hours, and that's when they all realise they need an implementation unit. So the question is, can you accelerate that and just persuade them that actually you might as well start with one because you'll need it in 3.5 years anyway. So that's the way I think about it.
Right, gentleman here, and then lady down there.
Thank you. Peter Kane, City of London. Two of the changes, Michael, that you didn't touch on, the first of which is localism, and which potentially has many positive attributes of innovation, the kind of changes that Margaret was talking about. But equally, it can also be a barrier to spreading good practice, and to, poor performance can linger in a way that is more difficult in more centralised models. So interested in how you reconcile the rise of localism with your model. And the second change is around the digital agile world that we're now living in. Again, big pluses in terms of availability of more data, potential to use it more effectively, but equally it can encourage almost a more short-term mindset. If it doesn't work, we'll throw it away, we'll try something else that's different, that in a way can play against your view that it's about determination, it's sticking with things, rather than just thinking the immediate kind of easy solutions to take.
Should we take two? Well, Alan, you go.
Right, Alan Howarth. Can we pick up on a couple of issues that were emphasised? One is leadership, the other is effectiveness. It's been assumed that the leadership comes from the Prime Minister in number 10. And I don't want to talk about particular personalities. I want us to think about the system. How coherently are decisions made? My impression has been over many years that number 10 does a lot presentation, a lot tactically, but the Treasury is absolutely crucial in deciding a great many of the priorities, and that process emerges out of some acknowledgement of financial constraints and opportunities, but a great deal of bilateral discussion between the Treasury and departmental secretaries of state, and a certain amount of divide and conquer. And you don't get coherent leadership priorities. Margaret's suggestion that we might do better if we brought the number 10, the Treasury and the Cabinet Office together, could perhaps open the way to greater coherence in leadership and prioritization at the top of government. And the other question about effectiveness is Michael has certainly talked about the changing world within which we have to operate. You didn't, I think, mention the EU, and one of my questions is how you get effectiveness in one country. And can I just add one more Calvin Coolidge story? He was even more laconic on one occasion. A deferential journalist asked him, did he have a message for the American people? And he answered in one word, no.
We won't hear that over the next 7 weeks. Thanks, Alan. Why don't you take these two, and then there are two there, and then...
What do I want to talk about? I mean, the issue on localism, I think we worry about that a lot. We've got a new landscape of very fragmented services now, and whether you look at education, whether you look at health, whether you look at the private sector delivering public services, it's hugely fragmented, and it's much more difficult in that to eke out best practice and to get best value. But I just think if money's tight, it isn't really an issue. I think if money's tight and we want to protect as best we can the frontline service for people, you have to ensure within a structure of localism that you take advantage of the power of the state to purchase and the knowledge of the state to do things better or do things less well. So I mean, I'm a localist in many, many ways, but I think sharing that knowledge and ensuring cooperation is absolutely key. It's mad. How often are we going to reinvent PFI and get it horribly wrong? With health trusts the latest one going bust only last week.
I think the first thing I want to say is, and it relates to both the questions, in a department, even if the Prime Minister, imagine a situation where the Prime Minister wasn't that interested in delivery, which can happen in any country and in any time, given the way constitutions work, you can do this stuff in a given department to deliver that agenda. So a departmental minister can be effective at delivery, and all the stuff we've been talking about can do it there. And David Blunkett actually was pretty fierce like that. I used to get those, I used to call them Blunketograms. My favourite one said, whoever wrote this clearly isn't committed to our political programme. And it was me. Anyway, but he was a wonderful man. And but you can do it in a department. You can also do it in a local authority, or the London mayor can do it. So this approach you can apply, and I've seen it work really well in Los Angeles and in the US states and in some local authorities. So that's the first thing I want to just put on the record. Secondly, localism actually is consistent with a strong centre, and Margaret argued that earlier on, and I think the strength of the centre is actually really important. And if your delivery, if you were a Prime Minister and your main manifesto commitment was to devolve power to local authorities and out through the big systems, a delivery unit would really help you get that done. And if you look at the big power shifts out of Whitehall over the last 30 years, whether it's the Academy programme led by Andrew, or the introduction of private sector providers in health, or the big privatisations back in the 80s, all of them needed a strong centre to get those things done. They wouldn't have happened otherwise. So devolving power often needs a strong centre because in effect you're breaking monopolies. So that's another thing. And I think the key thing as you devolve is to keep the capacity to learn at the centre, which I think you described actually very well, Margaret. And I do think the centre of government, just as the Department for Education is the centre of a system, you need to have learning capacity built into it, and that's a major issue. On the Treasury, Alan, I in my previous book I proposed this sort of restructuring of the centre of government where the Treasury and the Cabinet Office were much more integrated and collaborative around this agenda, and I think you've said something similar just now. I would personally back then have created a Prime Minister's department that had this learning function, that had the Treasury, and I think James, who's sitting at the back, James Quinault, who's running the implementation unit, his team is in the Treasury. There's no reason, there's no reason in principle, it will depend on who the ministers are after the election, but why he couldn't be at the heart of bringing about that change in the new Parliament. And then on the EU, there is no organisation on the planet that needs a delivery unit more than the EU, Alan. I once had the pleasure of sitting next to the EU Secretary General at a dinner, and we went through it, and he sent somebody to talk to me about it. He said, that sounds really exciting, and then it all drifted off into the bureaucracy and nothing happened. I think we should, the Britain should be appointing a commissioner to go and repeatedly say this, because the delay and the slowness in the programmes, the ineffectiveness of the spend undermines the case. I'm very pro-European, but the way they operate undermines their own case. They shoot themselves in the foot daily.
Right. To that lady there in red, and then gentleman across there.
Thank you. I'm Piali Descriptor from the Local Government Association, so I appreciated that last exchange. And I think what we would argue is that a lot of the localism we've seen so far is more delegation of delivery rather than true sort of bottom-up policy design and creative solution making. But I didn't actually want to raise that point here. I wanted to bring up the point about the citizens and the taxpayers in the title here, and about better feedback loops, so that actually effective governance is linked better to democracy and what people want. Because there's a lot of evidence, especially post-Scotland, that people feel quite distanced from Whitehall and they don't feel it's very responsive to their issues and their community's issues. And how do you build that into a system so that the solutions that we're coming up with actually respect what people want for their lives?
And behind you.
My name is Michael Barber. I'm from the World Health Organization, but I used to sit across from Tony O'Connor in the Department of Health in the strategy unit, and also worked on US health reform. I would actually really take issue of whether this sort of delivery model is applicable in the health service, both here in the UK and more widely. I mean, first of all, it assumes a unitary NHS system. So just to say from the US standpoint, you could not really implement that if you're in the federal government, because it's a federal system. Most of the health providers are private. In the Punjab, for example, 90% of health spending is private. So the federal government or the government has very little control over the health service. But even here in the UK, I have to say, I'm not sure it was particularly successful. There was an obsession with targets on waiting times, for example, which is really not an important outcome. I mean, because what we're really interested is improving health, actually, not in decreasing waiting times. And a lot of other countries were simultaneously facing similar problems, like the Netherlands, and actually, I think, introduced much more innovative programs that eliminated waiting times. And most social insurance systems like France and Germany don't have any waiting times, actually, for elective surgery. So I think this assumption that you can drive the process, it tends to focus too much on the targets. It really alienated the professionals and was ultimately abolished. So I'm not really sure that this kind of centralized, target-driven approach has been very successful in any health service. And that level of persistence has not been possible to maintain in any health services, to my knowledge.
Margaret first, and
Got me
Michael.
going. Actually, David Nicholson left the most Stalinist organisation that we've got in the UK, which is the health service. I always used to tease him about it. It was complete central control. That's the first thing to say. Second thing to say to you, it's such a mess at the moment. Whenever we look at any anything in relation to the health service, we have to have 6 or 7 people sitting in front of us to try and discuss, you know, cancer services, A&E waiting times, whatever it is, which are all outcomes. I mean, they matter to me as a citizen, as a patient, how long I have to wait for my first treatment if I get cancer, or how long I have to wait in A&E, or how long I have to wait to get things. They matter to me. Nobody is accountable, and therefore nobody's responsible, and therefore we're wasting zillions of, I mean, I'm absolutely convinced that health, more than anything else, could do with a really strong implementation structure, directed from the centre and implemented through its through the various things. And the other thing I'd say about health is actually it's also the service out of all the public services which is more run, and it links to the first question, more run by the professionals than I think most any other public service. And that's not good. That's not good. I have great respect for doctors and clinicians and nurses and all these people. They all work really hard, but actually I want to have the patient at the heart of what I'm doing, of what is delivered, and it's the one service which more than any other shows a lack of that sort of what I think is at the heart of reform of public services, which is putting the client or the patient there. And the only thing to say about democracy, which I really again feel strong, we think it all happens in elections. Elections are completely irrelevant in seeing people's participation in the design and delivery of their services. So, and democracy actually is getting that involvement of people in both the design and delivery is essential for raising quality and is essential for delivering equality. So we have to look at much more innovative structures for bringing people in, and there are plenty of them around. I mean, you know more about them than I do, but there are plenty of structures around, but I think it's a really important ingredient again in the reform of public services.
I'll come to that health service point because I want to comment on that in a minute, but I just want to comment on the previous question, which I thought was important. And in chapter 8 of the book, which is called Other People's Money, it's the bit about public sector expenditure and tax, and I've tried to address the point Peter made was, could you make this work in an era of austerity? And I've gone through and tried to make both interesting and readable the stuff on public sector productivity, which is some challenge, I can tell you. But anyway, I've set out in there a model for how to think about public sector productivity, one part of which is what do the citizens think about the service and how do you know what they think and how is that changing over time. So without going through all that, you could buy the book, but if not, you could just read the relevant 5 or 6 pages and let me know what you think. I'd be really interested in it because it's a really important thing to get right, and it's one part of improving a service that the citizens care about it and think that it's addressing their needs and aspirations, as well as that it's delivering targets. So what I say is there's 3 things you have to look at. One is delivering the goals, whatever they're set. The second is that there's this sense of growing legitimacy, and that really matters in health and education, where participation by the community actually makes a difference to the outcomes at 0 cost. You know, if parents spend more time with their children on homework, it doesn't cost the government anything, but the performance will go up. If people stop smoking and eat better and do more exercise, etc. So that's the second bit. And then the third bit is, are you leaving the organisation you took over better than you inherited it? Which is about the organisational health. If you do all those 3 things within the constrained budget, you are delivering public sector productivity. That's my argument. But I've gone into it in a bit more detail. So I'd really welcome comments on that. And it is trying to address the point you're making. And you can do that at local authority level as you could at government department level. On what you said, all I can say is sitting next to Tony O'Connor was of no benefit to you because you clearly didn't learn from him. I've argued this in the book. You can read the relevant pages. I don't think the healthcare.gov disaster that faced Obama would have happened if he'd had a proper systematic approach to delivery. I think that was a totally avoidable crisis. It cost him a year of progress, which only since the November defeat in the election has he begun to revive from. So to me, a delivery unit that was driving out that healthcare reform would have made a massive difference, and they blundered. On what you said about Punjab, I assure you we will deliver major improvements in outcomes in primary healthcare by applying this. But just to give you one example, the vaccinators under the system without a delivery unit until 8 months ago, on any given day, 22% of them were working, right? As a result, 4 months later actually, but it's now 6 months later, 81% of them were working every single day. It's not perfect, but it's a whole lot better than it was. Just getting people to do their job, this kind of thing, you need the data, you need the check, you need the line management, and you need the chief minister or the head of the health department or both focusing on getting that stuff done. Simple approach to delivery making a big difference. Health waiting times were a choice made by the British government in 2001 after an election campaign in which the patients and the community have been complaining about waiting times, and delivery thinking plus great activity in the Department of Health fixed that problem. If we'd been given another problem, we would have fixed that too. We took on MRSA in 2004. 5,000 people at that time were dying in hospitals of hospital-acquired infections. 2 years later, it was down to 3,500. The health service had been drifting on that. It was a scandal. We began to fix it. I wish it wasn't 3,500. I wish it had been lower later. But by applying delivery technology, we made a big difference. You can do this to any. There's no reason why health is different from any other subject on this. And it doesn't matter whether the system is publicly or privately owned or devolved or not. You can make a big difference.
So Margaret's got to go.
Yeah,
So
all I can say is we can agree to disagree, and maybe you could go and sit next to Tony O'Connor again.
We'll Margaret, thank you very much for coming. Delighted you came, and thank you for your contribution.
Good luck.
Yeah. Thank
Now, Terry, we've got 2 questions in the front. Jill, and then Jonathan.
Michael, I wanted to pick you up on this point that this can be applied to any problem. And one of the reasons the delivery unit sort of got itself abolished was, after you left, was it had sort of extended across this great waterfront of all these government corporate goals. And I've never in my department experienced the delivery unit in its very service-focused, performance-focused days. I was at DEFRA. We actually didn't find PMDU helped us very much on the sort of things we were trying to do. We had quite ambitious targets. We had stuff on climate change before we lost it to DEC. We had stuff on adaptation to climate change. We had stuff on natural resources. And actually these sort of routines, the data wasn't there, it comes with big lags. The sort of routines you're talking about didn't really work for our sort of public interest, public good issue. And I just wondered if in your reflections after you left, you thought about actually what different challenges those sorts of bits of government pose, and how you can apply some of your sort of thinking to actually make those work. My second question was going to be a very quick one, which was in some of our reports, we've recommended that actually implementation delivery is too much of an afterthought, and that we need some upfront implementation challenge before governments get committed to policies. And I just wondered whether you thought that was workable.
Right, thanks, Jill. And then I'll come to you in a sec. Yeah, I'll answer Jill first, and then thanks for now.
Well, thank you, Greg Parsons.
No, hold on. No, I'm just going to ask Michael to do that. Then you have your chance.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right,
Because there are 2 questions there, so we can move on to you.
Well, Jill, thank you very much. So I think that the phase that you're talking about when in the delivery, that the agenda was too broad, and the political commitment to the goals that had been set in that spending review was no longer, to be honest, there. There was a spending review that happened just as it happened roughly at the time of a change from one prime minister to another, and it never got the prime ministerial focus that it needed, and the agenda was too broad. And I'm arguing consistently for the importance of political will behind this, and it could be done at ministerial level or it could be done at prime ministerial level, but it needs to be there, and then not for having too broad an agenda and too complicated an agenda. So I think they were both mistakes. And then, there's other people in the room who were in the delivery unit at that time who could comment. But I do think that you can make a big difference on a range of complicated problems. You're right to pick me up on saying you can apply it to anything. I think that's over the top, and I withdraw that. But there's a very broad range of things that you can apply this, and it will work. And thinking, I wasn't quite sure exactly what you meant actually, and maybe I misunderstood. But thinking about implementation at the time you're designing the policy, having the same person doing it and delivering it is good. Testing things out, not about whether you're going to do it and not some little initiative as a pilot, but testing out the nuts and bolts of implementation before going more broad. All of those things I think are really important. I don't know if that's what you actually meant. Sorry.
So what we're interested in, for Lana, is whether the implementation unit in Australia, in the Department of Prime Minister, or in Canada, there's a challenge process that we seem to miss out on when a policy goes for political agreement in cabinet.
Right.
There's a bit saying, well, actually, it sounds like a good idea. Politics work, so we're going to do it. But actually, can we do it within resources, times, and stuff? And we don't seem to have that bit of capacity. We're just interested in whether you think that would work.
I think it could work. The one risk of it is that you scale back on ambition, so that it becomes a process for making proposals incremental when actually you want is ambition, and that depends on the people in the room, to be honest.
Right, gentleman there.
Greg Parston from Imperial College Institute for Global Health Innovation. Since the demise of the delivery unit, Michael, what we seem to have defaulted to as a change mechanism for public services in the UK is inspection. And yet Don Berwick from the Institute for Health Innovation at the World Health Summit 2 months ago said, if we learned anything from 100 years of inspection, it's that inspection doesn't work. Indeed, if you take a look at inspection in the health service and in education, inspection regimes here seem to exhibit none of the characteristics that you've talked about or Margaret's talked about as needed for proper delivery. Looking forward, what would you advise whichever government comes into place to do with inspection? And
Mark. Yeah, we'll take it because there are a couple more questions. Yeah.
Okay.
Mark Hidson, I'm on secondment from the Institute for Government to the delivery unit in Haringey Borough Council. My question, you suggested that Steve Hilton perhaps thought it was mere semantics to change from a delivery unit to an implementation unit. But I wonder whether actually that linguistic difference points at something more significant. So particularly I'd be interested in your reflections on how integral the PSA's framework was to the way that the delivery methodologies that you outlined were applied in central government, because in many ways that model was about delivering against a relatively stable set of outcomes and being quite flexible and perhaps innovative and responsive in the kind of tactics or the initiatives that you use, whereas there is perhaps now a focus on implementation, which is getting a particular government initiative from start to finish, and therefore almost inevitably a focus on the outputs and the politically visible outputs of doing that. Is that mere semantics?
Thanks, Mark. Two very interesting questions there.
Yeah, they're very good. I'm going to answer Mark's question first, not because it's more important. They're both very interesting, but because I think the sequence will work better. It's easy to forget how bold and innovative the PSA framework was when it was developed originally in 1998 and then refined in 2000 and 2002. And there were problems with it, and everybody accepts that going back. There were too many targets in 1998. They were a bit botched at the beginning. They were a late thought in the comprehensive spending review process. They were refined in the year 2000. They were refined again in the year 2002 and so on. And 2004 actually. But that was, it is actually very bold and was seen by the IMF at the time as very bold to say, we're allocating this money and these are the goals we expect you to achieve. And the delivery would have struggled to get off the ground without that work in the previous 4 years. We were set up in 2001, so like 3 years into the implementation of the targets, and most of the goals we were working on were a selection from targets that have been set in the 2000 spending review. And I do think the focus on defined outcomes for citizens was really important. There were big weaknesses back then, so it was bold and innovative, but nobody had really done any planning. You could go to departments and say, how are you planning to meet these targets that were set last year? They'd say, I don't know, we don't have a plan. They were just kind of hoping they would arise. So there were weaknesses, and some of the targets were badly designed, and we got better at target design. But I do think that there may be more than a semantic difference, that if you define delivery as improving the outcomes for citizens in a measurable way, you could have an implementation unit that implemented stuff that didn't necessarily achieve that. That is plausible. So I think it's a good point, and I personally always preferred the word delivery, although it has its own downsides too. And then, which leads to inspection regimes. I just want to make a point about delivery units. So it was abolished here, but there are at least the World Bank count 50-something delivery units around the world, not all of them working, but some of them making a big difference. Quite a few US states are using this approach. And so when people comment on whether delivery units are working, it's worth looking at the whole big picture. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is to pull all that together to show when they work and when they don't. I know that's not your question, but it leads into inspection, because inspection, it relates to the point I made earlier about the future of regulation and how that is going to work. We can't do without regulation, but we find it very hard to design regulatory functions that work. And many of the public sector inspection agencies like Ofsted or the Care Quality Commission are effectively part of a regulatory framework. And I know and admire the work of Don Berwick, but I don't agree that inspection systems have always been a disaster. I think for example, in education in the 90s, Ofsted was the biggest single influence on improving outcomes. I think the care, there is a whole quality performance issue in the health service, which, by the way, going back to the waiting times, part of the whole point of the waiting times was that you take those off the table so you could focus on quality. We knew that when you got waiting times down to 13 weeks on average, people would stop talking about that and we can move on to quality. You need some way of getting into quality. My frustration with inspection is not that it can never work, but that it's hard to make it work, and that you need the inspection agency to keep up with the cutting edge of change in a system, which is hard. And then you need to plough the learning from the inspection agency back into improvement, and that doesn't happen. So there are lots of, I'm not saying it can't work, so I don't agree with that, but I do agree it's difficult to make it work really effectively. But I've seen, like I say, Ofsted in the 1990s to me was a model of how you could make a really big impact on a system. One of the things I've argued in the book, sorry Peter, this is a rather long answer, is how you approach changes as a system improves. So you go awful to adequate. Inspection, top-down pressure targets are really good. You can mandate adequacy, but then the phrase goes, you can't mandate greatness, you have to unleash it. And at that point, the nature of the inspection agency needs to change. I've tried to go into this, and Greg, you've been working on this for many years with great success, so have a look at the chapter and see what you think.
Thank you. I think we have had an absolutely fascinating discussion for the last hour and a half on the issues raised, and I'm particularly grateful to questions, the challenges on various issues on that. And it's very interesting. I think one of our colleagues wants to comment to a delivery unit in a local authority. In fact, indeed, we just published some work on the adaptation of the PMDU model to Haringey, which is a very interesting paper drawing on that example domestically, as well as an international paper we did on what was happening in Maryland, which two of my colleagues wrote. So, Michael, you see, if you were a kind of really different type of author, you want to end the session half an hour ago so you could sell some more books outside. But you've still got the opportunity to sell the books. The books are outside, so are drinks for everyone. Could I, before asking you to thank Michael, also thank the Centre for Public Impact, working with them, and you're going to be working with them in future on this. I'm very glad to continue our relationship with you, with my predecessor, Andrew Dennis here, who worked with you very closely on education and your various appearances here. So very grateful for that. Looking forward to continuing debate you've now stimulated, and particularly what happens post-election here on many of the themes you've done. So could I ask you to join me in thanking Michael Barber?